that many of our Save Our Schools Arizona volunteers are well aware of vouchers and have worked with us to stop or at least slow voucher expansion. But we also know that Arizona is not the only state facing these issues or these efforts to try to privatize public education. So Catherine, would you tell us a little bit about other voucher programs in other states, kind of what that looks like nationally across the US?
Sure, and I just want to echo Jessica's thanks for having us as part of your webinar series and for all the work you do and the work that your supporters do as well to protect public education and improve it in Arizona. So I think to talk about like the state of voucher programs across the country, it's important to look at the history of private school vouchers and their origins. So the first kind of wave of private school vouchers in the country came after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And were really concentrated in southern communities who used vouchers as a tool to evade desegregation. Southern states offered these vouchers to incentivize white students to leave desegregated public schools. In some of the states where we work at SPLC, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi, tens of thousands of students left their public schools to attend segregation academies in the years following Brown. And these diversions of public funds were, direct response of white communities to desegregation requirements. And some states like Louisiana offered actually more in private school vouchers than they paid for public school students to attend public schools. And white flight from public schools actually also impeded districts' ability to raise funds. Property owners were less willing to raise taxes to support schools in this kind of dueling system environment. So while this era of vouchers were eventually struck down post-Brown, over the past couple of decades, we've seen vouchers reemerge in new forms and expand, but often around narratives of failing public schools that really remain systematically underfunded. And important to note that that underfunding really targets Black and Brown schools across the country in particular. So right now we have about 30 states with some type of voucher program, whether it's a traditional voucher program that directly funds students to attend private schools or a new form of voucher. We continue to see kind of new and creative ways emerge, like tax credit scholarships that fund vouchers through intermediary organizations or education savings account vouchers. And I know we'll get into some of the weeds on the different forms of vouchers. PFPS considers all of these diversions of public funds to private schools to be vouchers. But Florida is one example of these 30 states, of a state with several types of voucher programs. So it has 2 vouchers for students with disabilities, a tax credit program, and a program specifically for students who say that they were bullied at school. And a new program passed in 2019 that uses more of a traditional voucher structure to funnel even more money away from public schools to private school tuition. So when you take the sum of all these programs, Florida is actually diverting over $1 billion a year from public schools and public services to private schools. And as a result, it now ranks 41st out of 50 states in the nation in funding fairness of public schools. Other states, of course, devote hundreds of millions of dollars. Indiana and Ohio and Wisconsin, and of course in Arizona, states being some of the top diverters of public funds to vouchers. So while the landscape is that we do have voucher programs in a majority of states, dozens of state legislatures each year, last year and this year, take up voucher bills, the vast majority of which do not pass. The most recent new voucher programs to pass were in Tennessee and the one I mentioned in Florida. But dozens and dozens of voucher proposals are not successful each year. The 2020 legislative sessions in particular, because of COVID, are still wrapping up, but it looks like we will have similar results in that way as we did in 2019. So advocates, of course, continue to make headway at rolling back voucher programs across the country, including through litigation. And the PFPS team has challenged voucher programs in Nevada back in 2016 and Tennessee this year that were both struck down by courts before their implementation. It also includes organizing and advocacy. And of course, you all in Arizona have really held the line on stopping voucher expansion after voters overwhelmingly rejected expansion in 2017 in subsequent legislative sessions. So we continue to see legislative advocacy be successful as well. And we'll talk a little more about some of those trends.
Awesome. And would you say a little bit about, so the Nevada case, the Nevada vouchers would have been, had that actually been funded, the first universal voucher program in the United States. Can you say a little bit about why that never happened, either one of you?
Sure. So that was a great victory for those fighting to keep public funds in public schools, because as you say, Sharon, that would have been a universal voucher program. That was an education savings account voucher program. And that program was challenged by Education Law Center and Munger, Tolles and Olson and others under Nevada's education clause of the Nevada state constitution, which says that the legislature has to fund public education first and fund it in an amount that it deems adequate. And because the money for that universal voucher program was going to be taken from the allocation that had been made to fund the public schools, it was unconstitutional under the state constitution. And it was struck down ultimately by the Nevada Supreme Court. And so it never got implemented. The money never flowed out to that program, which was very important, especially because Nevada's public schools are some of the most underfunded in the country.
Yeah, thank you. So, Jessica, say a little bit more about, you talked about public funds, public schools. I think our Facebook Live stream may not have been running when you defined it. So if you maybe would just give a quick definition of what that campaign is and where it came from, and then talk a little bit about some of the trends that you see in terms of voucher bills and what advocates for public education can look for in the coming year or just in the future in terms of what we might expect with voucher legislation.
Sure. So for anybody who wasn't here at the very beginning, Public Funds, Public Schools, PFPS is our national campaign of Education Law Center, Southern Poverty Law Center, and the SPLC Action Fund, and the law firm Munger, Tolles and Olson to fight private school vouchers and other diversions of public funds to private education uses. So to keep public funds in public schools because voucher programs drain scarce resources away from public schools, and because voucher schools often can discriminate against students, vouchers can increase segregation. For all of those reasons is why we're doing this work. And you asked about trends in vouchers. So let me point to a few different things that public education advocates can look out for and that we've seen in previous years. As Catherine said, vouchers, the way that vouchers are funded has changed and evolved over the years, and what vouchers are called has changed and evolved over the years. But the bottom line is that all these programs are vouchers that take public money away from public schools. So there's traditional vouchers that pay for tuition at private schools. There's education savings account vouchers like you have in Arizona and many other places where part of the public money that, for example, part of the per pupil amount that would have gone to public education is deposited into a personal account that parents can use to pay for private school, but also importantly for a lot of other private school expenses like transportation or books or sometimes homeschooling. So Arizona adopted ESA vouchers early on. They're increasingly popular. That's the type of voucher that was seen in Nevada or in Tennessee, passed last year and now stopped right now by the courts. And voucher proponents are pushing the idea of ESAs during the pandemic. For example, the Heritage Foundation has recently suggested putting education funding toward ESAs. So this is one to know about and look out for. And actually Public Funds, Public Schools just did a webinar on ESA vouchers that will be up on our website. There are also tax credit vouchers. So that's another form of vouchers that has now been around for a while. And there are some tax credit vouchers in Arizona as well. And this is when individuals or corporations can get up to 100% dollar for dollar credit to send the money that would otherwise have gone into taxes, that would have gone into the public treasury to pay for things like public schools. It's instead given to what's called a scholarship granting organization, and then they give vouchers to families to pay for private school. And finally, another trend I want to mention is that there's a push to expand the use of 529 accounts, which you might know as college savings accounts, to expand their allowable uses to K through 12 private education expenses. And Arizona is one of the states that is now allowing that. So as those types of programs expand, more money is flowing to private education uses. So those are different types of vouchers. It's also a common strategy to start out with a small voucher program targeted to a specific student population, such as students with disabilities, and then continually try to expand the students who are eligible with the end goal of a universal voucher program. And that strategy is also illustrated in Arizona's ESA program. So frequently targeted groups of students are students with disabilities, low-income students, students who are in so-called failing schools, and more recently, as Catherine mentioned, we've seen the rise of proposals for child safety or bullying vouchers for students who say they were bullied in school. As Catherine said, most of these voucher programs aren't successful, but that's because we know what to look out for, and we have to continually understand how vouchers are shifting and evolving and what the new proposals are. One more important point that I want to make, so it's not all vouchers expanding, is that Arizona isn't just an example of how programs can grow. It also demonstrates how excellent advocacy can halt and roll back voucher programs. So as Catherine was mentioning, SOS Arizona's work to spearhead the ballot referendum that halted what would have been a very large expansion of Arizona's ESA program. And other advocacy that you all and others have done in Arizona. For example, last year, other voucher bills either didn't pass out of committees but weren't taken up by the full legislature, or those bills didn't advance. And more activity this session, but there are a lot of voucher bills that haven't moved too far in Arizona and elsewhere. So these are the bright spots in the strategy to look at, that there's a lot of success in fighting voucher expansion as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we did in the 2019 legislative session, there was a bullying bill very similar to the one that Florida has that didn't make it out of committee here. And like you said, I think one of the things that has been really disheartening for us to see in Arizona, as our public schools are struggling so much, to watch these voucher programs expand and expand and expand. When ours started, it was just this really small $1.5 million a year for very few number of kids who have very high special needs. And then it's just grown exponentially since then, as our public schools have increasingly faced a really, really terrible crisis. And we know that our teachers are buying their own supplies, and so it's been frustrating. And I think that's something that's motivated a lot of our volunteers, is really wanting our state to recognize and prioritize our public schools. So
definitely a tactic to get in there with that,
yeah.
small program, and some will even build in automatic expansions year after year. So they don't even have to take legislative action each year for all of a sudden in 10 years it to be a much larger program.
Yep. Yes. So we spend most of our time paying attention to the state of Arizona and what's going on in other states. But Catherine, could you talk a little bit about what's going on at the federal level, especially now with the COVID relief efforts and the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act that has provided some funding to states? Tell us a little bit about what's happening at the federal level with vouchers.
Sure. And currently there is only one federal voucher program, meaning passed through federal legislation, and it's for Washington, D.C. And there is, some decent research on this program, meaning valid research, showing that the program does not improve student achievement or other measures like parent satisfaction. And so I know there's continued advocacy to address the Washington, D.C. program, but Sharon, as you said, our current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is a longtime proponent of vouchers. and seeks to change the federal landscape, to expand it around vouchers. And so during her time as Secretary of Education, she's pushed several voucher programs at the federal level, and we've seen her use language like education freedom in those efforts, which mirrors, the segregationists that I spoke about earlier, who pushed kind of our first wave of vouchers, because they didn't always explicitly talk about their racist motivations behind vouchers following Brown, but instead spoke about freedom to choose their schools. And we've seen President Trump too, and his State of the Union address, refer to public schools as government schools. And so I think, there's a lot of dangerous language around public schools and what it means to establish these kinds of vouchers coming from this administration. But there is a proposal in both chambers of Congress to pass what is called the Education Freedom Scholarships and Opportunity Act. It's a $5 billion federal tax credit voucher plan. There have been proposals for education savings account, ESA vouchers, specifically for children of military families, and other voucher bills. And none of these have seen much activity in Congress beyond introduction. But in the midst of Trump promoting vouchers a good bit over the past week, Senator Cruz, who has sponsored this education freedom voucher in the Senate, has renewed calls for a hearing on that voucher. It remains to be seen if support in Congress will change, but it does not appear that there is Democratic support for the vouchers. And of course, Betsy DeVos is a pretty unpopular Secretary of Education, and there's been a lot of really great advocacy, like your advocacy in Arizona, that I think has kind of changed the conversation around vouchers and their harm to public education. But DeVos is not necessarily stopped by the lack of support in Congress. She's now using some of the federal stimulus packages that have passed to provide relief, federal emergency relief, to schools and districts across the country during this COVID-19 pandemic, and following all of the school closures that resulted. And so she has done a couple of things to advance her privatization agenda under the CARES Act package. One is she's established a grant program for states to apply to receive funds from a $180 million pot to set up microgrant vouchers, which really are structured like education savings account vouchers. And those applications are open. It remains to be seen which states will ultimately apply or be awarded. That is something to be watching for in your state advocacy, wherever you are. She has also released guidance for districts to try to require that they that they provide private schools with a greater share of the CARES Act funds than is required under law or allowed under law. These are Title I funds that are intended for low-income students in public school districts. And DeVos is encouraging states to follow her guidance, suggesting that they should share these funds with private schools based on private schools' total population. So public schools that serve majority low-income students would have to share their funds with private schools that potentially serve no low-income students or exclusively wealthy students. So this has a disproportionate impact on low-income students and students of color, who are the majority of Title I schools across the country, while white students and higher-income students are the majority of private school students across the country. So those are a couple of things that we're watching at the federal level.
So we have a question from a listener that I think is kind of related. So see if either of you would like to take a stab at this one. So what sort of private schools are emerging to be recipients of diverted funds, like maybe online schools or what we are seeing popping up in Arizona, micro schools? How are they packaged, or what is it that they're doing to try to draw people away from public schools? I think this is especially related to our COVID moment. as we're all trying to figure out what it means to be in or not in the classroom now as we're dealing with the pandemic. So any thoughts on that, either of you?
I'm happy to chime in with some thoughts and Jessica add yours, but yeah, I think, we've seen certainly there's been great reporting in Arizona in particular around some of the kind of fraud and abuse with private school voucher funds. And that's been true in some of the states where I work, where private schools are set up in kind of strip malls and, certainly don't have the resources to meet students' needs. And I think the shift to online and supporting online private voucher schools only kind of, you can at least see these private schools that pop up, but it's a lot easier for, I think, to take advantage of folks who really are desperate to figure out distance learning and online learning to just set up a shop that is inadequate in terms of meeting students' needs.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's always a concern about sort of fly-by-night private schools wanting to participate in voucher programs because of the lack of the same standards that apply to public schools in all sorts of areas: academic standards, fiscal accountability, transparency of how they use their funds. And when you talk about online education, those concerns can be exacerbated. Obviously, public schools and all schools are grappling with distance learning right now out of necessity, but the proposition that should be a permanent way of educating many students is something else entirely, and something that is of concern to those who are fighting voucher programs and privatization programs.
Yes, thank you. So Jessica, tell us a little bit about, we haven't gotten a question about this, but I know we will, so I'm just going to ask it. Many of us have been following the U.S. Supreme Court case, Espinoza versus Montana, and the decision could really show up any day. So could you tell us a little bit about what this case is and what the implications are of it?
Yes, this is an important case. So I will just start with a little bit about what it's about. So in 2018, the Montana Supreme Court struck down a state voucher program that provided one of those tax credit voucher programs, a dollar-for-dollar tax credit for donations to scholarship granting organizations. And the Montana Supreme Court said that that tax credit voucher program violated what's called the no aid provision in the Montana state constitution, which prohibits the use of public funds to aid private religious schools in Montana. So the U.S. Supreme Court accepted that case for review and is expected to issue its decision probably sometime this month. And several pro-voucher groups have argued that that Montana no aid provision was motivated by anti-Catholic bigotry and that it violates the religion and equal protection clauses of the U.S. Constitution. So Public Funds Public Schools was one of the groups that filed an amicus brief, or a friend of the court brief, in the Supreme Court on this issue. And we did that to make 2 points that we think are really important about this case. The first is to provide some historical context for Montana's constitutional reform process in the 70s, which shows clearly that they put that no aid clause in the Constitution, prohibiting the funding of religious schools, out of a desire to ensure that the limited state funds for education would stay in public schools, because almost basically all private schools then were religious schools in Montana, and still most are. And they wanted to keep that money in public schools because they knew it was so important, and they knew that funding for public schools was scarce. The other thing that our brief highlights is that peer-reviewed research that we've talked about, that studies consistently show that voucher programs negatively affect student achievement. And that the research that's cited by voucher proponents, much of it suffers from critical flaws in research design and validity. And so that's an important perspective, we think, for the court and for the public to have on vouchers. So what are the possible outcomes of this case? There are many. We hope that the US Supreme Court will uphold the Montana Supreme Court's decision that the voucher program violated the state constitution. If the Supreme Court reverses that decision and goes the other way, then there are a number of different things that they could say about voucher programs or about state constitution's no aid clauses. So where do we go after this? A lot of it will depend on the specifics of what the US Supreme Court says. But one thing that is really important to note is that whichever way the Supreme Court decides, there are many avenues for challenging vouchers in court, for example, under state constitution's education clauses, like we talked about in Nevada, in addition to all the other non-litigation ways to challenge vouchers. So those avenues would not be affected by the Espinoza decision. And PFPS will have analysis when the decision comes out, and we'll have follow-up materials and programming. So make sure to sign up on our website for our updates, and we will be watching for that decision.
Thank you so much. You know, you mentioned earlier that you guys did your own webinar in ESA vouchers. So I'll just plug that, because even though I feel like I know a lot about it, it was really interesting. And so if that's available on your website, I think some of our listeners and volunteers will be interested if they didn't catch it the first time around looking at it. So you guys know, and many of our listeners know, that people across the state of Arizona have just worked tirelessly to make sure our lawmakers prioritize public education. And in spite of the fact that we've been doing this work for these last few years, and in spite of the fact that year after year after year, every poll that's ever done in Arizona shows just incredible widespread support for public education, regardless of political party, regardless of demographic. So many people support public education. And yet, in spite of that fact, our governor, just in this legislative session, signed a bill into law that expanded our vouchers once again, even though the voters in 2018 really clearly said, no, we don't want any more voucher expansions by voting no on Prop 305. But he signed a bill into law that allows vouchers, our taxpayer dollars, to go out of our state, to leave our state, to pay for private religious school tuition in schools in other states. So we are always looking for ways to stop vouchers, to slow the growth of vouchers. We've maybe in our conversation touched a little bit on this, but Catherine, or both of you, but maybe we'll start with Catherine, talk a little bit about what's worked in defeating or slowing vouchers, or what kind of things we might think about to challenge this kind of incremental expansion that seems to just continue happening.
Sure, and this is something that I think we all think a lot about, because it's our mission at Public Funds, Public Schools. And as Jessica mentioned when she talked about what it is that our campaign does, we use a couple of different strategies. And so the first being litigation, and we've talked throughout this webinar about examples of lawsuits that have resulted in courts declaring voucher programs illegal under state constitutions, sometimes under the education clauses or the prohibitions to fund private or religious schools. And Nevada and Tennessee are recent examples of voucher programs that have been struck down by courts that we touched on a little bit earlier. But we focus a lot on supporting state legislative advocacy too. And I think where we've seen advocates be successful in defeating voucher bills, it is because of the kind of dedicated advocacy that you all do at SOS Arizona. And it's about really holding lawmakers accountable, of course, educating them about all of the flaws and how vouchers can hurt students and public schools. But also, you know, I think making noise in communities where representatives are voting for vouchers and communities are not aware of those decisions. I think there is not a lot of support for vouchers in the public, and there are sometimes representatives from districts that don't even really have private schools supporting vouchers because of party leadership or other, you know, demands. And so I think really that kind of local level advocacy and attention to the impact of decisions being made by state legislators is really important. I think that there are also some creative things that we've seen be successful if you are fighting a voucher program that ultimately might end up passing. One is trying to get sunset provisions inserted, meaning that the voucher program won't go on indefinitely. It will be more of a pilot, and at some point, the legislature will have to consider whether it's been successful. There was a pilot program, an ESA voucher in Mississippi that passed 5 years ago and just expired. The legislature did ultimately end up renewing the voucher program, but because Mississippi had built in requirements for analysis of the program and review of how it was doing and had identified a number of flaws, it is a much more scaled back version that got renewed. And so I think if you can work to get those two things inserted into bills that are moving or to existing programs, those are ways that we've seen, advocacy be able to kind of slow or halt ultimately voucher programs. I think some of the exciting developments over the past year in defeats of voucher bills have also resulted from some of the public school teacher demonstrations. And I think we're in a moment right now where support for educators is pretty high with all of the children doing, distance learning from home. And so I think really, listening to educators and to, the budget fights that they've been waging and really the budget cuts that they've been trying to teach through without having all the resources that they need are, a big part of what we've seen be successful too. And then, we work at PFPS to support high quality research on the effects of vouchers. We've seen that really be essential to make the arguments that we make because they're based on, research and evidence of outcomes for vouchers. We've also seen investigative journalism, I think, be really important. And so that's another thing I would plug is working with local journalists to study your voucher programs. We've seen pieces in Louisiana that really highlight how well voucher programs perform if they were held to the same grading standards as the public schools in that state. We've seen some really good reporting out of Arizona that I mentioned too around fraud and abuse. Just last week, Huffington Post published a piece that found that millions of our public dollars in Florida go to private schools that push conversion therapy on LGBTQ students. And so I think in the absence of accountability by a state, that kind of investigative journalism becomes really critical to demonstrating the negative impacts of vouchers where a state won't do that. And finally, I think, we've seen some work around message reframing that I think is important. This freedom and school choice narrative that we see from the administration and from others is, I think there have been some inspiring attempts to kind of reframe whose choice it is, right? Because it is ultimately the private school's choice based on application criteria, which can be about students' academics or behavior or their identity even, but also cost above and beyond a voucher and resources like transportation. So Journey for Justice, for example, is a national network of grassroots organizers that has a We Choose campaign calling for what they say is, real equity and not the illusion of school choice. And so I think helping to reclaim some of that messaging and push back on messaging from voucher proponents is another important strategy.
We actually have G2 Brown from Journey for Justice is going to be one of our guests in a few weeks on one of our next Speaking of Schools conversations. So we're really excited about that. And then I also wanted to give a shout out. You mentioned Mississippi. The Parents Campaign in Mississippi is a small grassroots organization, and we reached out to them early on, and they've been so kind to us and helping us kind of understand the whole landscape and the work that they've done. So they
do great work
along, yeah, and doing such good work in Mississippi. So that's really good to hear. So, okay, we have, well, let me just ask one other quick question about ways to fight vouchers, because I think in Arizona that has been really important to us. And so a couple of things I'd like to highlight about what you said. We were surprised, naively so, that our legislators in Arizona who live in rural communities or communities where not a single one of their constituents could even use a voucher would vote for legislation that would take money out of our public schools. And so it's one of the things that Save Our Schools has tried to do is to have conversations like we're having with you guys. We do a road show that, of course, we're doing webinars. We used to actually go on the road and do road shows in the pre-pandemic days. But I think really helping constituents, just individual people, understand the importance of that school that's right there in their neighborhood and making sure that they can find a voice and letting their representatives know how important that is and how important public school is to them. I think that's just absolutely critical. And sometimes people think, oh, you know, I'm just one person, like one voice doesn't matter, but it really, really does matter. And so I think just having those conversations, we love to have conversations at Save Our Schools, just, you know, one-on-one, standing in the line at the grocery store. We can't even do that anymore, I guess, in our pandemic world, but really just helping
6 feet apart with a mask.
Yeah, yeah. Just helping people understand why this stuff is happening and how we can have a voice in making sure our legislators and our country prioritizes public education and recognizes public education as a cornerstone of American democracy. So that is so important to us. So I appreciate you gave some great examples of sunset provisions, messaging, all of that I think is so, so important. So thank you for all of that. Now, Jessica, will you tell us a little bit about the resources that PFPS has on your website that people might be interested in? And then we do have a few questions coming in from our listeners. And for those of you who are listening, it's not too late to put your questions in the comments, and the people working tech behind the scenes will send those along to me, and I'll do my best to ask our panelists, or at least combine several of the questions and see if we can get through some of them. So Jessica, tell us about the resources that you guys have that we can have access to.
Sure. And one of our most important goals, as we've mentioned, is to support other organizations, national, state, and local. And as you've mentioned, there are many grassroots and local organizations who are working on these same issues alongside us. So we want to support them and individuals, as you said, having these conversations and understanding the negative effects and the harms of vouchers is one of the most important things that we can all support. So, and to that end, we have a webinar on our website now by Professor Julie Mead talking about why public education is the cornerstone of our democracy and helping to frame that and helping to tease out those ideas of why it's so important. So I encourage everybody to watch that. Our website is pfps.org. I'll put up a slide with that at the end of the webinar, but pfps.org, and if you go to our contact page, you can sign up for our email blast, which will tell you when we have a new resource or a new event. So let me just tell you about a couple of the resources that are on the website. For legislative work, we now have a bill tracker where we're gathering and monitoring proposed voucher legislation in all 50 states and the US Congress. So if you go to bill tracker at the top of the website, you can search by state, you can search by type of voucher bill, and get a whole lot of information on bill content and the status of those different legislative proposals. On our advocacy page, we have resources including legislative analysis, like of the 2019 session, so you can see all the different ways that voucher proposals were defeated. We also have policy briefs there, for example, one on Mississippi, and fact sheets. Right now we have a fact sheet summarizing the research on the negative effects of vouchers, and we will have excuse me, more fact sheets coming out in the coming weeks, as well as there are recordings of our webinars, and as that series continues, we'll have more of those recordings. On our research page, as Catherine mentioned, our research page has a wealth of information, summaries of all of those studies and other policy briefs. and from the government, from think tanks, and also short summaries and then links to the full studies. So you can have that information at your fingertips when you're doing your own advocacy. And for those who are interested in litigation, our litigation page has a list and a summary of every voucher decision that's been handed down by courts across the country, as well as information and court documents on PFPS litigation, like the Tennessee litigation that we're involved in, and examples of amicus briefs. So visit our website for all of that, and please feel free to also email us PFPS or to email Catherine or me, and we'll be happy to try to get you those resources. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see that information too.
And as Jessica is sharing her screen, I will just say that one of the hats I wear for Save Our Schools is Director of Research, and I was trying to keep track of all the bills across the country related to vouchers. So I am so grateful to you guys, not only for doing that, but for putting it together in a way where it's so easy to access so much information. It's just incredibly helpful. So yeah, that's great. So
it's nice to hear that, and the continued sort of morphing of what voucher proposals come out makes it difficult to track, right? There are constantly new names and search terms and the like, but
yeah. So we do have a question. I'm curious to see if you guys have an answer for this, or just like what your comments would be. So one of our listeners or viewers asks, do we know how often or at what rate parents leave voucher programs once they discover that private schools can reject them, deny services to their kids, or increase the price tag at any time? And once they realize how inconvenient and unrealistic it is to use a voucher, especially for working or lower income families. Here in Arizona, this viewer knows dozens of parents who've tried ESAs and then quit and returned to public schools once they've realized just how much of a scam it is and not just a magic bullet solution. So have there been studies that look at the number of people who leave voucher programs or return to public schools?
I don't know of a study that tracks that, and the person who asked the question has named a lot of the reasons that we also hear for families leaving voucher programs. The price exceeds, or there were hidden costs that they can't cover, or their child needs particular services and their rights to those services aren't protected in the private school, lots of different reasons. I don't know of a study that tracks that, and part of what hinders having more studies on voucher programs in general is the lack of requirement to report information about them in legislation, for example. So it's important that we try to get more of that data so that there can be more high quality studies on that.
Yeah.
One example I would note is, I think that's true. I think we don't have a holistic picture of, all of the students who are leaving private school vouchers for various reasons and what those reasons are. I mentioned earlier that the Mississippi ESA voucher, which is a voucher specifically for students with disabilities, had a requirement in the legislation for the legislature to study the program upon implementation. And one of the things that it found was that of parents awarded vouchers for their children, a third of those parents ultimately could not find a private school to meet their child's needs or a private school to accept them. They refused to admit voucher students with those needs. And so that gives a sense of, in Mississippi, the difficulty of finding a school that will do all the things that public schools are required to do for students. But I don't think that we really have a full picture like the participant asked.
Yeah, and that's definitely true in Arizona. There's so little accountability or transparency for what happens with the money when it's, put on a debit card, which is what happens in Arizona, and given to the parents, or how the child does academically. We just know so little about what happens. So we have another question that is really interesting. I think it kind of comes at all of this from a different angle. And this person asks, what can we do to improve our schools so that parents don't feel the need to remove their students? Current discipline strategies at public schools unfairly target special needs and minority students, and classrooms are overcrowded. So I'll take a first stab at that, just because I know this is a tremendous issue in Arizona, because we have the second most crowded class sizes in the country. We have the highest student to counselor ratio in the country. So in Arizona, it's about 1 counselor for every 920 students. The recommended ratio is 1 to every 250. And so I think it is a very valid point that our listener is making about discipline strategies, about the pressures that our teachers are under and the lack of support that they have when they're in the classroom, because they can't call in a counselor, because if they even have one, it might be a counselor who's splitting his or her time across 3, 4, or 5 different schools in the district. And so it just makes it very difficult. And as a teacher myself, I get really angry when people say, oh, it's just a few more kids, as if adding, you know, just 5 more kids into your 4th grade class or your 3rd grade class isn't going to be that big of a deal. I think for anyone who's been in a classroom with kids, especially kids with special needs, especially kids who are dealing with active trauma in their homes, you know, it is so much stuff that goes on in our classrooms in addition to academics, and to just put a few more kids in a classroom is just not good for the kids, not good for the teachers, and makes those teaching situations very, very challenging and difficult. So do you guys have thoughts on that? What schools can do to improve?
Yes, thanks. That's a great question and a great point. And I can just start out, Catherine. The project of strengthening our public schools is continuous. And we are, our individual organizations and PFPS, deeply devoted to addressing the challenges that many students face in public schools. And those exist, and there is ongoing work to make sure that all students get an adequate, equitable education and that their rights are fulfilled in public schools. One very important point, and that we can all work toward, and as part of Public Funds Public Schools mission, is having adequate resources, because so many of these challenges come back to adequate funding and resources for our public schools. So making sure that they are adequately funded is fundamental to addressing all of that.
Yeah, I'll just affirm what Jessica said. I mean, I think it's a great question, because although our campaign is, our strategies are around fighting vouchers, I think ultimately, you know, our goal is to ensure that there is a thriving public school in every community that meets the students' needs in that community. And I think one of the, you know, really beautiful things about public schools is that they, you know, can and should be shaped and led by their communities. And so when we see public schools get all of the resources that they need and, you know, operate in that sort of democratic way, you know, I think that it's a system that can work for communities and is structured in a way that, you know, can really be shaped to benefit and serve, you know, the students in a community in whatever way, you know, they see fit. And so I think, you know, our strategy is to ensure that this system that we have in place that really can be successful and in many places is successful for every kid. And you don't get there until you, you know, resource our schools. And for us, you know, a strategy to get there is to stop this diversion of public funds to private schools.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I want to just say a big thank you to Jessica Levin, who is from Public Funds for Public Schools and the Education Law Center, and Catherine Dunn from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I really appreciate you guys being here and letting us pick your brains a little bit, get your insights, and for all that you do to really push to create strong public schools across the United States, and all of the help that you guys have given and will continue to give us working on the ground in the States and Arizona. We are very, very grateful. So thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And
Likewise,
likewise,
fun chatting with you. Thanks for all you do.
You too. Bye, guys.